Okay, welcome now to the session on semiosis and nature with our two speakers, Nick Guardiano from Southern Illinois University, who is functioning as the guardian angel for the American Philosophy collection at the Morris Library, and Vincent Colapietro, who is professor emeritus at the Pennsylvania State University at Penn State, and visiting scholar at the University now of Rhode Island, so that he can be close to the ocean. The procedure is going to be that we will have about, each speaker will have a 20 minutes max, but they will basically be between 15 and 20 minutes, depending on how the conversation goes, how their presentation goes. Then I have a presentation, a comment, a set of glosses that will take about maybe 12 minutes, at which point we will be free to have a full-ranging discussion of whatever sort we desire to have. So that being said, let's start with Nick's presentation on, as we know here, on the metaphysical grounds and aesthetic primacy of universal semiosis. Nick? Okay, Vincent, it's time for you to have your...
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
In the sun, but in the...
Okay, thank you. I am delighted having been paired with Nick, and I am delighted as well as humbled and honored to have Bob comment on my paper. Buckler suffered a very severe stroke in March 1979. This prevented him from presenting at a meeting of this society a paper entitled Probing the Idea of Nature. In that paper, eventually published, he suggested the very fact of the concept of nature lending itself to so many and conflicting uses can be seen as a cue, as a hint to metaphysical thinking rather than a cause for despair. Here I intend to join him in doing just that. And I intend to do so in reference to the intersection between Buckler's ordinal naturalism and his general theory of human utterance, with an emphasis on his metaphysics of utterance. In terms of scope, power, and suggestiveness, Buckler's theory of judgment stands shoulder to shoulder with Peirce's theory of signs. Moreover, his book, Nature and Judgment, invites us to read it as part of a lineage to which Woodbridge's Nature and Mind, Dewey's Experience and Nature, Cohen's Reason and Nature, Randall's Nature and Historical Experience, and other works whose titles do not so immediately suggest such a critical link. For example, Santayana's Realms of Being, Roy Woodseller's Evolutionary Naturalism, and Larry Cahoon's The Orders of Nature, to which all of these are monumental contributions. It is hardly incidental that questions regarding language, and more widely, the use of symbols, thus questions regarding the meanings of meaning, are central to these works. As becomes manifest in them, but especially in Buckler's Nature and Judgment, the meanings of nature turn out to be intimately related to questions regarding the nature of meaning. Whatever else nature is, it is a matrix of diverse, conflicting, and irreducibly plural meanings. This implies that nature is a provision of some orders in which self-identification, self-interrogation, and self-alteration are ineluctable and revelatory processes. I should stop myself here and say something I ought to have said at the outset. In the background, but not too far in the background, is a plea for art. And as important as the disclosive power of the natural sciences is, and there's no question, it is that the power of those sciences is extremely powerful. As powerful as that is, I would contend that human artworks are no less, or at least significantly disclosive, powerful in their capacity to disclose. Okay. There are discourses or orders in which nature, in effect, becomes conscious of itself. And it becomes conscious, therefore, of its irrepressible fecundity, its irreducible plurality, and its complex relationality. So questions regarding the meanings of nature display the fate of these questions becoming, at least for some, at some points, reflexive. For this and other reasons, philosophical idealists, such as Schelling, Hegel, and Royce, become as relevant to nature and its meanings as avowed naturalists. Spirit emerges from nature. Reflexive interrogation is a dramatic development within the natural world. Nature is indeed rendered unintelligible if questions regarding its meanings are rendered impossible or anomalous. Whatever else nature is, to repeat, it is a matrix, or better, it's a matrix of meaning, or better, it's a matrix of matrices of meaning. On Buckler's account, meaning is irreducibly plural, invincibly open-ended, and essentially perspectival. One of the meanings of nature consequently points to nature as a provision of innumerable orders. The concluding chapter of Nature and Judgment is entitled Meaning. The philosopher is, Buckler notes, faced with the alternatives of preserving his initial definition of whatever it is, at the cost of query, probing, seeking. Faced with that alternative, or modifying them in accordance with query. Buckler unhesitantly chooses the second of these alternatives. Rather than being definitively fixed at the outcome, meanings are in subtle and manifest ways transformed in the very processes of their articulation. Self-modification in the order of judgments is but a specific instance of a widespread tendency in the natural world. Judgments bear traces of their origins, as do meanings exhibit traces of the matrices from which they develop and in which they evolve further. The metamorphosis of meanings is a phenomenon calling for the renewed exploration of philosophical naturalists. So meaning in this context must be functionally explicated and also perspectively located. It is, of course, possible to detach part of a perspective, including a singular judgment, and unite it with another perspective, also to extract elements from a perspective and use them in conjunction with products of yet another perspective. But such detached or extracted elements or parts of perspectives are likely to mislead us regarding the nature of meaning. In a form of a rhetorical question, then, Buckler drives this point home when he writes, "But if the meaning of a judgment is determined by the nature of its function within a perspective, How is it possible to dissociate the judgment from its essential conditions, from the order which is part of its being as a judgment? Of course, as a rhetorical question, it isn't. Meaning is a specifiable or discoverable function of whatever facilitates processes of judgment in whatever mode of judgment. And the modes of judgment are the assertive, the active, and the exhibitive. At the highest level of generality, then, meaning is defined as some function or other within some perspective of other. Of equal importance is Buckler's stress on the invincibly incomplete character of what so often turn out to be initial or inaugural judgments. And here I'll skip again. As Bernstein notes in a very fine essay on Buckler, a judgment is, on Buckler's account, not a discrete event, independent and separate from everything else. Every judgment reflects something other than itself. And then to quote Buckler, a judgment does so by virtue of which it is the judgment it is and has the meaning or communicative effect it has. This communicative effect is itself efficacious. Its meaning is a function of its efficacy, and in part, this means what the judgment makes available both within the perspective it is articulated and possibly for other perspectives. Our query into the meaning of meaning points to this link between meaning and efficacy. The product itself of any judgment, and here I'm quoting, always in part is a master of the producer. The product is a master of the producer. The ensemble of judgments embodied in, say, a novel or a theory, a work of sculpture or lines of poetry, in effect lay claim to the person who has produced them. The product is something with which its producer must contend. It is, moreover, something over which its producer does not possess complete mastery. There is a sense in which the product, in both the process of its coming to be and afterwards, its being more or less secure in its existence, there is a sense in which the product, in this twofold sense, makes the producer. So, two features then that I've highlighted are the efficacy, or if I might have skipped a part, but you get the point. The efficacy and availability of judgments. That's let me highlight the point that is in some sense behind my paper, but also makes itself visible. It makes itself visible both at the conclusion of this very fine essay, Probing the Idea of Nature, and it makes itself visible in Buckler's book, The Main of Light, which is a book on poetry in a very broad sense. So in the essay, Probing the Idea of Nature, he writes, even with the inevitable omissions required by such a compact treatment, should it be hard to see that every natural complex has its mode of actuality and has, in addition, possibilities that represent its limits? Or that whatever we produce, whatever we discriminate, whether a technological trend or a unicorn, a teapot or the bush that was not consumed, cannot be dismissed, cannot be ruled out or declared null, but calls for ordinal definition. And even more pointedly, at the very end of this essay, Buckler writes, should it be hard to see that an author of poetry, like an order of poets, is itself an order of nature. So let me break for a moment. And it's the first day of spring. And rather than talk about poetry, I'd like to read a poem. It's by E. Cummings, who has very interesting links to Emerson, obviously. And it seems to me to capture something important for this occasion. And I do not mean to, by implication, be endorsing what has to be felt as a certain kind of obscurantism implicit in this poem, but I do mean for us to feel the challenge of the voice of poetry on this occasion, the first day of spring. O sweet, spontaneous earth, how often the doting fingers of prurient philosophers pinched and poked thee. Has the naughty thumb of science prodded thy beauty? How often have religions taken thee upon their scraggly knees, squeezing and buffeting thee, that thou mightest conceive gods? But true to the incomparable couch of death, thy rhythmic lover, thou answerest them only with spring. I rather like that poem. I don't endorse what might be seen as its implicit obscurantism. I'll cut right to the final paragraph. Buckler writes, our meanings are ways in which we are related to the complexes of nature, including the perspectives and products of human beings. What we mean is partially hidden for the simple reason that our ties with existence extend far beyond the conditions of any present usage or any present action. As a result, we in any given situation always mean more than we intend, though never as much as we might mean. In his ordinal naturalism, Buckler brings in to as sharp focus as any theorist with whom I'm familiar, the ties with nature, providing us with resources for judging anything and everything, matters trivial and momentous, singularly personal and broadly human. His writings unmistakably exhibit the spirit of query. That spirit was directed toward probing our loci in nature, our loci in those orders of judgment in which the very meaning of meaning, judgment, and nature itself were at the center of concern. If I have done anything to honor his thought, and by implication Larry, since Larry studied with him, then my efforts have not utterly lacked their own efficacy. The hope behind this hope is to have rendered Buckler's singular contribution to our collaborative query more available than it might have been. But of course, you must be the judge of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benny, for this wonderful scaled presentation that intersected with many of the things that are intrinsic to this whole problem area, but it's a very interesting and very different rotation. I have a short set of remarks about this. I will read it out to you. It's about 6 pages or 6 or 7 pages, but it is in a rather different format than I would think the usual comments on the speakers. It is both a pleasure and a challenge to have the opportunity to reflect upon the presentations of such a vital theme as the fecundity of nature as a dynamic matrix of meaning, and in particular, aesthetic meanings. We can consider the papers of Nick and Vincent as differently slanted forms of engaged query, conceptual rotations, or core concerns, linking both implicitly and explicitly metaphysics, semiotics, and aesthetics. They both are and are not reflections on or analyses of the same things, looked at from different angles. Both papers have a constructive and reconstructive hermeneutical focus that involves a combination of thinking with and thinking about their sources and their themes. Nick's paper takes the form of a kind of analytical tapestry or mosaic, composed of different threads or pieces of different sizes. Vincent's paper offers a strong voiced meditative unfolding of the implications and various imports of Buckler's open analytical grid. The basic contours and implications of their frameworks are not in irreconcilable opposition. To trace their complex intersections is not, however, the task of a short commentary or for those who are unintelligibly rash in trying to do so. I want to offer instead a kind of gloss rather than a critical commentary on their core theses, which will be alluded to in various ways in what follows. Such a gloss takes the form of querying exemplifications. This procedure allows me to give examples that raise questions and enable or provoke further words from our presenters or from the rest of us as to how we are to frame the implications and motivations of the various forms and background conditions of an aesthetic approach to nature as a matrix of meaning. In Goethe's Faust, in Part 2, Act 1, Scene 5, we find the following lines uttered by Faust in a dialogue with Mephistopheles, taking place in a dark gallery. Our sense of awe, what keeps us most alive. The world chokes human feeling more and more, but deep dread can still move us to the core. In conversations with Eckermann that took place on February 19th, 1829, Eckermann reports the following comment of Goethe. The height of human attainment is amazement, and if the object of man's amazement is an Urphänomen, he will have attained tranquility. He can have no higher awareness, and he ought not to seek anything beyond it, for here is the absolute limit. But to average human beings, there must be something beyond. They are like children who, upon peeping into a mirror, instantly turn it over to what lies on the other side. These two passages articulate the contours of a fundamental or originary existential aesthetic stance toward nature or the world. In the lines from Faust that David Luke translated as awe, das Schaudern, it really means to shudder. The ability to shudder, to have this feeling, is described as humanity's best part. The world, Faust says, inflicts severe costs on our continuing ability to be affected, to be ergriffen. But once having been grasped, one continues to feel and accept at one's deepest level the tremendous or extraordinary, or the dreadful, das Ungeheuer. What is that extraordinary or tremble-inducing dreadful? Is it about the whatness of the world, its many orders, or about its there-ness? As to its whatness, we find ourselves, as we have heard, entangled willingly or unwillingly in dynamic, ever-emerging multiplicities of natural complexes or form worlds. They affect us in multiple ways, just as we affect them. We, the Bucklerian perceiving and judging animal, must learn to attend to them, to be with them, to be steered and to steer them, to take them up and translate or articulate them into orders of explicit meaning, or recognize that the orders are themselves self-articulating, pregnant with significance, if not necessarily for us. As to its vastness of what lies behind or within as ground of the self-engendering and ramifying orders of nature, where do we look? Or is looking for it a metaphysical fallacy? Do these orders point beyond themselves? What could they possibly point to? Or are they to be taken as a manifold of appearances? Goethe's remark, recorded by Eckermann, addresses these points in a way that bears upon the questions that are raised by the papers just presented. Here, the focus is not on the shudder, but on being amazed, das Erstaunen. Amazed at what? As the Urphänomen, the originary phenomenon of appearing, of becoming manifest. What is the relation between the shuddering and being amazed? Are they alternatives? Shuddering is the Peircean proper significate effect or interpretant of encountering the sublime, of being grasped by the fact of the groundless, unlimited domain of potencies at play in nature that realize themselves in the orders of nature naturing. Amazement is the proper significant effect of being unrestrictedly attentive to the unbounded emergent novelties of appearings that function as lures. Amazement does not look behind the phenomena for a source outside of appearing. Appearing contains its sources within itself. They are potencies manifested in the appearances, generally a semiotic phenomenon, attended to in the play of musement. How is it most fundamentally to be apprehended? We have just heard cited, or should have, that is, I wasn't sure who was going to cite what from the various summaries. We have just heard cited, or should have, Emerson's claim that nature is a symbol in the whole and in every part, and Peirce's claim that all the universe is perfused with signs, if not composed exclusively of signs. Indeed, Peirce had even held that we could see the universe as the poem or argument of God. For Goethe, as for Buckler, the universe, if a poem at all, is self-writing, and it seems strange to think that universe, which resembles the dance of Shiva, is making a case for itself or arguing toward a conclusion functioning as an end, and a rational end at that. What would it be arguing for? What is the universe really perfused with? But still, Goethe's advice is that the perplexity that arises when we ask these questions should not lead to a philosophy of constant turmoil. It should lead to tranquility. Tranquility is not stasis, which is impossible in our lives and time. It is an achieved or realized effect, an outcome of insight, or of the courses or pathways our experiencing of the orders of nature takes. Such orders fill our embodied minds and minded bodies with distinctive tones, giving what Peirce called a peculiar quale to my consciousness. Peirce, following Emerson, intends to construct, as he says, not a philosophy of the head alone, but one which pervades the whole man. This is our wish and goal, too. I agree that nature can, as we have heard, be taken as both a semiotic and aesthetic phenomenon. If Goethe and Buckler are right, and if Emerson's and Thoreau's deep demythologizing radicality can be accepted, nature has no traditional utterer other than natura naturans, however we choose to name or unname it. It is a pluriform sign field of itself as natural complexes of embodied qualities, as we have heard, and their contemplation gives rise to what Peirce called, admitting his ignorance of art, aesthetic enjoyment. He writes, in aesthetic enjoyment, we attend to the totality of feeling, especially to the total resultant quality of feeling presented in whatever we are contemplating. Peirce calls this feeling a sort of intellectual sympathy, a sense that here is a feeling that one can comprehend, a reasonable feeling, a toned modification of consciousness. Any object or natural pattern we perceive in nature is situated in a field and is attended to in its unique qualitative particularity. whose defining traits steer and guide the felt effort of our perceptual engagements and forms of attending, with our attempts to articulate their symbolic pregnance or felt import, the three Persian categories right there, and the three interpretants that Nick pointed out. This is what we find with Emerson's wandering in the woods and sensing nature striving to break out into music, and Thoreau's tracking the traces of a fox's mind in the snow. Such experiences induce or exemplify contemplative query that comes to words in Emerson's and Thoreau's writings, and that evoke for us and lead us to their object, the multiplicitous appearings of nature. The voice of the chirping cricket set Thoreau to thinking, philosophizing, moralizing at once. Nature's rhematic power is rooted in the symbolic pregnance of things, events, situations for us perceiving and judging animals. Such a pregnance is the ground of the promissory, the eventual, and the efficacious dimensions of meaning. Nick and Vinnie draw these notions out for us in a wonderful fashion. Contemplative query is the outcome and development of amazement. It can be thought of as a practice or reflective habit, as we have heard from Buckler. In Buckler's words, it is the interrogative spirit, methodically directed. It is one of invention and probing of the limits of the multiform adjudicative inheritances or debt or indebtedness we have received that fund our ways of grasping the meanings of nature, and of our recognizing that we are caught or placed irretrievably betwixt and between orders, between interpretative orders of immanence and transcendence, with their fateful consequences for our life practices. That is, these adjudicative inheritance are interpretation systems that also inform whether we can find ourselves in nature and whether we can find immanent structures in nature. Consider in this regard about adjudicative inheritances and the complexities that come with that. In Philip Larkin's poem, Church-Going, which begins with the prosaic line, "Once I'm sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud short." In Larkin's case, who practiced church-going, it is another church that was not worth stopping for. Yet stop I did, he writes. In fact, I often do, and always end much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for. What was he, firm believer in something beyond, looking for in this space filled with a tense, musty, unignorable silence? A space filled with familiar objects of a dead tradition that point to a beyond. What was the point of his visit? Larkin answers, "It pleases me to stand in silence here." The empty church becomes for Larkin a focusing lens that augments and clarifies, perhaps not without nostalgia, his sense of living in a complex, historically laden meaning field. "A serious house on serious earth it is," he writes, "in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies." The church, not nature, is a lure for Larkin. Surprising, he says, a hunger in himself to be more serious, a place to grow wise in and to die. The church's graveyard for Larkin is the burial place of transcendence. Emerson offers a kind of unintended proleptic gloss on Larkin's poem. He writes, "I like the silent church before the service begins better than any preaching. How far off, how cool, how chaste the persons look, begirt each one with the precinct or sanctuary. So let us always sit." Larkin is walking around in churches and graveyards. Emerson is walking around in nature and sitting in the church. Larkin is begirt with the affective and conceptual resonances of discarded beliefs and Bucklerian adjudicative inheritances. Emerson's begirt setting is one of silent prayer. But what is prayer for Emerson? Prayer, he writes, is the contemplation of the facts of life from the highest point of view. Contemplative prayer A form of query or amusement is the unhurried seeking of such a point of view. Strangely enough, Larkin's church-going, dependent on the church being empty and silent, is itself a kind of prayer, but his highest point of view differs radically from Emerson's, although they both arrive at a form of self-reliance, albeit differently toned. Larkin and Emerson, this is the last paragraph, Larkin and Emerson exemplify what it means to be caught in the liminal or threshold space between different orders of meaning. Both are pulled toward or tempted by some form of turning the mirror, that there is nothing behind the mirror, a world of transcendent meanings outside the orders of nature, is for Larkin a profound existential loss that he accepts. But for Emerson, that nature is a symbol in the whole and in every part, leads us toward Goethe's deep aesthetic and semiotic proposal. He writes, without haste, but without rest, if you wish to advance into the infinite, explore the finite in all directions. Is this not in the last analysis what Peirce and Buckler are proposing? Okay, let us go to, we can go to the chats, or we can first ask whether Nick or Vincent want to say something. Everybody should unmute themselves right now, if you can hear.
I think we should go right to the audience.
Okay, let me look at the chat and find out if we have questions here. We have a question from Jessica, but I don't know whether Jessica is still here. She wrote me.
That's not me. That's from the beginning of the session, remember?
What did you say, Jess?
That's not me. Who's next on your list?
Okay, Nick from C. DeMarco.
I'm happy to go to the
There's
crowd
a
if
question.
you want. My remark was early on. Let me just say quickly, the papers and Bob, your comments are so rich and have so many resonances with my own preoccupations. I'm just delighted. My little thing early was just a remark to Nick, particularly about whether he would wish to speak to the fruitfulness of a dialogue between Clive Bell and Peirce in light of Bell's metaphysical hypothesis, which is chapter 3 of his book, Art. It's the least discussed chapter of that book. And the Peirce's talk about significant form, which is a phrase that Bell uses in a somewhat different way. And if you want to do that, Nick, that's fine. And if you want to just kick it open and we'll open it up, that's fine. I'm happy either way. With thanks to all.
Okay, well then perhaps there's, okay, Michelle?
Yes, thanks. Thank you so very much for that last piece, Robert. That was quite beautiful. Your examples were very apt. I study Peirce, so I very much like the dialogue shared as you presented it with Emerson as well as Goethe. My question, I suppose, is about art and poetry, and it's not a Peirce-specific question. Really, I was interested, Vincent, when you were talking about Buckler, and you use the idea of the aesthetic of art and the making of art, of the art piece, as being that which informs the artist. In other words, the end so-called object becomes, or has been all along the process, the creative accumulation toward which it becomes. And there's lots of different ways to put it, but the reason I'm asking about it is because I've just had to write something on, I was writing on Heidegger and Iris Murdoch, and I was thinking Peircean thoughts in the background. But Heidegger's origin of the work of art is very much in line with the way in which you described the piece of art being that which inspires the maker of it in its process. And I wanted to ask you I don't know Buckler's work very well, only for purse reasons have I ever read him. So I was curious about aesthetics in that sort of German idealistic, in that period, German realism or creativity. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So in the three modes of judgment, there is what he calls, Buckler calls the exhibitive judgment, and the ways in which we judge for the sake of exhibiting structures, forms, radiances. And art is a mode of judgment in which the exhibitive function is preeminent. Let me just touch upon a fundamental difference, and I don't want to come off today as being harshly critical of Kant or Heidegger. However,
Heidegger, don't worry about that. That's
however, you know, the fixation on origins curious to some of us, and it seems to me that the word that Buckler uses is the career. It's not that the origin is unimportant, but it's the ongoing open-ended career launched by. And let me call your attention. I am getting no money for product placement here, but Nick's book is really a fine book, and it covers the paintings of the Hudson School. But then so does John Stirr's book, Pragmatic Fashions. And it seems to me that these books have a refined sense of the historicity that is not a nostalgia or preoccupation with origin, but the way in which, to use Peirce's phrase, highlighted by Nick, the way things catch on, the way things are carried forward. So the fixation on origin from a pragmatist naturalist point of view is always a little bit perplexing. The other thing I would say is that we are the producers of our work. That cannot be gainsaid. However, there's a sense in which as they're being produced and as they are finished, we are in a sense their products to some extent. And the complementarity between producer and product varies from case to case. And I'll just stop there.
Can I just follow up for 1 second, please, Robert? I just wanted to follow up by saying that helps very much, because I was attempting to say, I wasn't using Peirce explicitly, but thinking and being as a creative process are simultaneous, which it does away with this notion of the Germanic origin tradition, which Heidegger was coming from with the origin of the work of art. But I hadn't spelled out any Peircean claims in that paper. So thank you for putting it very directly. And for the book references.
Anybody else? I would say that the whole issue of origin, though, is not really, in a way, the Heidegger's notion is that the Ursprung, but that's a kind of, gives the impression that you have an event, but there is a kind of process of emergence that is found in the result, that one cannot pinpoint exactly at what point the process of painting or of composing or of writing a poem where it is realized. So there is, Heidegger should have been better served by talking about the realization of the work of art rather than the origin of a work of art, because it is a process. There's a large interesting literature on this. I'd recommend one book. I don't have any stake in it, but Kira Linsky, who teaches down at the Rhode Island School of Design, wrote a fantastic book called The Storm of Creativity. She's a practicing architect. And, it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. Christopher Bart, who is our husband, is also an architect, and he wrote a wonderful book on mind and matter from the architectural point of view, but it deals with that the origin of artifacts of every sort, and also linguistic artifacts, are dependent upon the material bases. And those two books on Mind and Matter by Bard, B-A-R-D-T, and Linsky, L-E-N-S-K-Y, are just super things that from the outside are using these, or interacting with this whole
Hey, Bob,
kind of origin.
Bob, you're in charge of the queue. You might want to call on someone else at some point. We only have, I think, 7 minutes left.
But nobody else is raising, oh, Larry.
We've all added to the chat, I'm quite sure.
Bob, there are huge numbers of people in the queue.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Jessica, does see there's Larry? Okay.
After you,
Go ahead.
No, Larry, go ahead. Larry, you were first.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll try to be quick. So I appreciate the papers very much, and Bob's commentary. For Nick and Vinny, the general question would be, by the way, yes, Buckler's a naturalist, like Margolis, who, both from the same school, but they had nothing to do with each other, wind up being their own kind of objective relativists.
Right.
And art is the most important thing to each one of them, at least more or less. Okay, quick. Someone has to tell me what is not a sign. Okay, what's not a sign, what isn't a meaning. Whether signs must occur in context of communication or do not need to, whether signs obtain, whether there are living beings in the neighborhood or not, whether signs are, whenever there's a causal relationship, is there a sign?
So if we get down and dirty with the detail, the fossil is a sign, even in a world in which there aren't folks yet, or possibly ever, present to interpret it. So a sign is an interpretable. And it does ultimately refer to a quasi-interpreter, but its interpretability is not dependent upon an actual interpreter being present. So potentially, possibly anything is a sign. Contextually, only some things happen to turn out to be signs, and it's functional.
But who can do the interpreting? Like, in other words, do you need something like, let's not say human beings, let's say a smart animal?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so
even a machine is, in some sense, a quasi-interpreter.
okay, all right.
Organism. I think John had a question.
Jessica is there, and then John. Jess?
Okay. Jess. Sorry.
Actually, I'm quite sure John wrote down first, so go ahead, John.
Okay, John.
He's saying I should go ahead, and we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to do this. I find these talks fascinating. I love the idea of the reality of a work of art or a book. Anybody who just wrote a paper or a shortened version of the paper for this, knows how the work can be the master of what we decide. I think I love that. And I love the E.E. Cummings poem. I think I put it in my dissertation ages ago, but it also gave me a basis for asking this question to both of you. So I have always liked nature answers only with spring in a Santillanan sense, and I see it as similar to Santillana's line, nature laughs at our dialectic and goes her own way. So I wonder, my Santillanan materialism leads me to ask, I see how we can see all these things as signs. And every time I hear biological explanation get to the level of DNA and messaging and encoding, I always say, you've gone to metaphor. I don't know what you mean anymore. I don't know what's really going on. So I just wonder, is there an extent to which when we see everything as not just having the possibility of being a sign for some interpretant, but as being signs, are we anthropomorphizing? That's my question.
Yes,
But it's
happily. Errol Flynn in Robin Hood was accused of speaking treason, and he said fluently. So are we? Yes, we're trying to anthropomorphize fluently. We're trying to do so, but I think there's a difference between being anthropomorphic and anthropocentric. We cannot but fall, and this is Buckler actually, as well as Peirce, we cannot but fall back on metaphors. Mechanism is a metaphor. And how apt, so metaphors catch on and they carry us forward. They get us into trouble.
I'm not sure everything's a metaphor.
We get in the traffic jam that Larry referred to in the previous session. So it seems to me that it's inevitably anthropomorphic to some degree. We have to guard against it, but we cannot. To say that I'm communicating with my animal or with a dog is not a case of projection.
Right. No, exactly. And I think what I'm going to do in the next session is going to dovetail on my question to you. So I'm happy to leave it at that.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes, and we got John next.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Let me see if I can ask this super fast. Vinny, this is primarily a question to you, picking up on your notion of efficacy here, right? And so unlike the E.E. Cummings quote, your presentation made me think of Humpty Dumpty, who after claiming that words mean what he wants them to mean, asks, which is to be master, that's all,
Yeah.
right? And so the notion of efficacy carries with it some notion of mastery, some notion of power, right? And that seems to me to involve a kind of politics of semiotics. And I wish you would say a little bit about not just the aesthetic side of things, but about the politics of efficacy.
Right.
Who in a particular context is authorized to create meanings as opposed to use the meanings of others?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I think it actually is the opposite of the Humpty Dumpty fallacy, because I think there are, this is pluralism. This is genuinely pluralistic, and so there are plural loci of meanings, and so there's inevitably there's a contestation of meanings. And so the most simplest acts of naming carry with them tremendous political consequences. So
Exactly right, and that's why it's
right. And so
the question: who's to be master?
Who's to be? It seems to me that
1 minute.
yeah. So I would say.
Your person for 2 years.
We need to forge dialogical solidarity, and think of mastery as a joint authorship, not a solitary voice. Right.
Okay, we are out of time because John and Jess now have 15 minutes to recuperate and to get themselves. I can't say get themselves to the physical location where they have to give their presentations, but they are present at the location right now. So thank you everybody for your attention and for appearing and being willing to put up with these wonderful papers, which we do not put up with at all, but have really absorbed and been provoked by. So good.